The Apple I computer was the first highly accessible, very popularized, approachable sort of system that people could use in their homes. It was designed by Steve Wozniak as this sort of human interface. He wanted to humanize computers and he wanted to have them be accessible for people, which is why you have a sort of integrated monitor and a keyboard system with the motherboard. That was one of the first times that that had ever happened with a home computing system. Before, you had these giant teletype machines and these weird sort of cobbled together components, and yes, it does look a little cobbled together, but the bones of an integrated system are there.
The collecting of vintage computers and the history of vintage computers is very much like car collecting. You know, if you look at a Ford Model T and then you look just nearly 20 years later, you see a vast change. Vintage computers are the same thing. It's very primitive, these computers from the mid-1970s, especially the Apple I. You know, you look at it and you see what we have to go through just to kind of turn it on and to get anything slightly useful out of it, versus your iPad. You turn it on, it just works, you know, within seconds. You didn't have that back then. It's interesting that many of the early computers were driven by video games. The Apple I has no real graphics, it's all text-based, so most of the games are text-based or something like that. But most of the programs out there were games. So BASIC is important for various reasons. Not just on the Apple I, but just in general, BASIC was most people's first introduction to working with computers. Today, people don't really have the same concepts that they had back in the 70s and 80s, where you were able to actually instruct your computer to do something you wanted it to do. Where are the limits to this? There's a lot of limits. It's a lot less, you know, than a modern system. But could I put one online? Sure, I could. I'd have to use some modern components to kind of hook up to it and do some programming. But you can do some interesting things with an Apple I. Well, the Apple I is really just this board. Even though it was just a board and you plugged in your own keyboard and your own transformers and your own video monitor or television, it worked. What Apple was is even though they only made less than 200 of them, they applied techniques that were mass production techniques that Steve Jobs had learned at Atari to the personal computers. They delivered a machine that actually worked when you got it. So, well, the most important element, honestly, are these two chips here. This is the Wasmon, or the Apple I's, basically its memory of what to do. Not RAM, but actually the program that makes it possible. After that, obviously, the 6502 processor, which is the heart of the machine, is extremely important. The 6502, after the Apple I, pretty much was the heart of the home computer industry until the mid-80s.
Being able to have this sort of like seed artifact, it's very hard to collect the beginning of something. And we can show this to people on the museum floor and say, this is the beginning of something. This is the beginning not just of Apple computers, but so much else in the digital age.